Thank you for joining today's Teaching with Technology Brown Bag session, Upgrading Your Online Presentation. Our presenter today is Mr. Brandon Henry from the ETI. To start us off for today's session is Mr. Henry.
If you had a superpower, what would it be? For my 10 and 13-year-olds, it's an exciting hypothetical. For me, after a day of asking, reminding, and re-reminding them to tackle chores and tidy up, my superpower wish is far simpler: the ability to be heard the very first time I speak. Now, we may not be able to fly, and getting our kids to listen the first time remains an elusive dream for most parents. But in medicine, there's a superpower far more impactful than invisibility or super strength. It's the ability to take the most complicated, life-changing information and deliver it with such incredible clarity, accuracy, and persuasive punch that it fundamentally changes how people understand things. It gets them to act, and in the end, saves lives. And when we're teaching USU students, this is exactly what we're aiming for. And I think it's fair to say that that's the shared goal for all of us here. Now, maybe you've been putting all of your energy into what you're saying, and that makes perfect sense. That knowledge is everything. But today, we're going to pivot. We're going to talk about how we say it, transforming our presentations into these powerful drivers of learning and real change. Because in medical education, our words are often our most vital tools. Okay, so think about my opening. I've introduced a theme. I told a story. That was my spark. Rather than just jumping into the presentation and listing all the things that you should do to make your presentation better, I tried to create a relatable context behind what I'm trying to present to you today. And as you'll see, I'll continue to sprinkle in those elements throughout the presentation to try to keep the story going. Our students get a lot of information pretty quickly. If the students are constantly asking, why is this important? And how will I actually use this? It's going to be a lot harder for them to develop their reasoning and get those new ideas to really stick. And that's where using narratives and actively engaging learners can make a real difference. Educational research emphasizes how important it is to set a memorable context and help people make relevant connections. So while we all know the traditional lecture can deliver the goods in terms of information, there's a real danger of learners getting swamped if they don't see the bigger picture. And unlike our friend here, students can't read minds. So how do we build those connections? What if your content doesn't really lend itself into a traditional narrative? Well, this is where we build a narrative. Not so much in the sense of maybe traditional storytelling, but taking elements from storytelling structure. So this list here can help you think about areas of your lecture that you could modify to engage your students. How does this particular lecture material fit into the grand scheme of the student's education? How do historical cases relate to medicine of today, given, the advances in technology? What happens if you get it wrong in a clinical setting? So how do you overcome that? Keep in mind now, you don't have to use all of these, but maybe, you can find segments in your presentation, especially in the more critical areas of your lecture to maybe inject a little storytelling to help break up the content. Okay, so we talked a little bit about narrative ideas to your lectures. Let's get into the instructional design bit and discuss how to show effectively to reduce cognitive load and improve learning outcomes. A lot of these come from Richard Mayer's multimedia learning principles. And so the elements that I'm going to discuss are redundancy principle, spatial contiguity, temporal contiguity, coherence principle, the signaling principle, and modality principle. So let's start with the redundancy principle. Here's an example slide I see quite a bit in a lot of lectures. How many are guilty of doing this to your slides, just putting all of the information right onto it? The redundancy principle tells us to combine narration and graphics or animation simultaneously rather than just text. That's a lot to take in when you're talking. So let's take all those notes and put them into the speaker notes section of your presentation and walk the students through it. Remember, you're giving a presentation. We're not writing a book. So if there's a large amount of text information that isn't in the textbook, this is important. If it's not in the textbook and you feel that the students would benefit from having, create a supplemental handout like a PDF to give it to the students, as a supplemental piece to your lecture. If it's in the book, you can direct them to the book to read it, because all of that information that you're talking about, if it's on the screen, they're probably not going to write all that down. They're not going to have time to write all that down. So you might want to supply that in a different way. How many of you use images like this in your presentations? This is not a bad graphic. It's fairly thorough. Parts are labeled pretty clearly. It's got the names of everything and arrows. But there's a better way to do this one. Spatial contiguity is to organize your words and your pictures to be proximal in space. So before in the previous one, and we'll come back to that, you had the little highlight numbers with arrows pointing to everything, and then you had the list of all the pieces off to the right. This example here shows that kind of combined together, so your pieces are a little bit closer together. So when we put them side by side, they still have information on them, but the one on the right gets the information to the student a little bit more efficiently than the left image. The left one, even though it's thoroughly labeled, you had to kind of go find the number, find it on the list of what you're talking about, and go back and forth, and it makes it a little bit more difficult. So spatial contiguity, put everything together proximal in space. So we'll stick with our skeleton theme here. And we just showed this as being a good example, but what's something that might be a little bit wrong with this if you're discussing skeletal anatomy? There's a lot of information on this image, especially if you're talking about a specific area. You've got all the listings of all the different bones all over the place. And you can't talk about all of them at the same time, right? So this is where temporal contiguity comes in. And that's where we're talking about organizing words and pictures to be proximal in time with your lecture. To only show the parts that you're talking about on screen, only the relevant information. And that way you can keep your students focused. Time it out between builds if you're using builds. This way you're not overwhelming the students. They're focusing on what you're saying and not trying to read everything on the screen. Okay, moving on. So there's a lot to take in here and a lot of kind of weird stuff. So makes it kind of hard to understand what the important parts of this slide are. It says design for social change, but we've got, different images of things on here that don't make a lot of sense. So coherence principle tells us to eliminate all the extraneous information on the slide and keep the visuals focused. So what we've done on this one, obviously, we've gotten rid of the non-essential graphics and we've created something that looks a little bit more towards the title of the slide. I've also reduced the text considerably and made it a little bit more readable. Here they are side by side. You can see on the bullet points that there's less words on the new one. It's much cleaner. You're still getting the topic across of what I'm talking about. So on the left-hand side, it's just, structure new business models to diversify withholding. It's a little wordy. I changed it to structure new business models. The next one, gravitate to situation-oriented business models, blah, blah, blah. Situation-oriented business models. Just take out the extraneous words that we don't need and make your slides a little bit cleaner. Signaling principle. Who uses their mouse while they're lecturing to highlight areas of the text? Can you see my mouse moving here? Maybe I'm talking about the skull and I'm going to move my mouse up here and point to it. Or if I want to talk about the hand bones, I move my mouse over here. Some people have a tendency to overdo that and they treat their mouse almost like a fidget gadget or whatever. And So they start talking about the skull, and now we're talking about signaling principle, and now we're talking about this over here and these pieces, and their mouse is just moving constantly. It can be very distracting for the students. So a signaling principle, what we can do is add highlights to your images. Keep your hands away from the mouse and just add extra slides to your presentation to highlight the areas that you're talking about. Now, on this one, I've got a bunch of them highlighted, but a better way to do that would be also to zoom in, make your image larger to focus in on the specific areas and give the student time to digest what they're seeing before moving on to another highlight. All right, so maybe you're thinking, well, let's get the best of both worlds. Let's put all the information on the screen and we'll put the graphics on there, and then they'll have everything in one spot. I'll do that. Let's talk about modality principle. This is similar to the redundancy principle, but here we're going to speak the explanation rather than using large blocks of text. Okay. So again, like I mentioned before, take your notes, put them in the notes section or the speaker notes of your presentation. Best practices, explicitly recommend using illustrations and diagrams to limit the text on your screen. This helps maximize visual learning using high quality images and ensuring visual materials are clear, legible, and unobstructed. Now, this graphic here, I've got a couple leaders and things on there. I would probably, I should have made those a little bit bigger, but this was an example image that I got from the web. So, use high quality images and limit what's on the screen so your students don't get overwhelmed. Because if we consider the dual channel theory that says we have an auditory and a visual channel to intake information, your audience has to choose to either listen to you or read what's on the screen, and try to figure out what the images are. Then they have to organize that material mentally and then integrate that information into their own sort of personal context and how it relates to them. So there's a lot going on. So if you think about your slides, if you've got a ton of text and a bunch of images, and then you're also talking about that, and some of those images may or may not relate to exactly what you're saying at that time, you start overloading those different channels and you're going to lose the viewer. So spread it out. One thing to remember is you kind of have unlimited number of slides that you can use. So you don't have to cram everything onto one slide. Take one item, put it on the slide, talk about that item, and then make a new slide and add as many slides as you need to spread it out a little bit. So if we combine the modality principle, that's speaking the explanation rather than the text, with the coherence principle, which tells us to eliminate extraneous content, you can follow these tips to create effective slides. So, has anyone heard of the 6x6 rule when creating slides? The ETI, we talk about this quite a bit, but 6x6 is, no more than 6 bullets and no more than 6 words per bullet, if you can. Sometimes it's tough and you can go 7, 8, but if you can try to keep it under 6 words, that's best. You want to use high quality images. Sometimes people like to take things from the web and grab them and just drop them in and then try to resize them bigger and they get all blurry and digitized. If you can get the highest quality image possible, that's better for your presentation. You can also find Creative Commons images out on the web that may be useful. So, as I mentioned before, if you have to break the 6x6 rule and add more text, if you're adding it to the screen, perhaps put it in your speaker notes. And that also helps you kind of decide what's important, what you want to talk about in your notes. And sometimes you end up getting rid of things that you're not even going to talk about in your presentation. Okay, student engagement. So, how do we get the students engaged if we are presenting an asynchronous presentation? Well, good question. Active learning results in improved knowledge retention and creates a deeper understanding than passive learning. So, for online lectures, this can be accomplished in a couple of ways. Simply providing reflective questions, for the students to consider in your lecture as you're going along. I've, kind of done that a little bit in here, asked some questions for people to kind of contemplate as I'm going along. You can also create knowledge check questions in tools like Panopto. If you're part of USIS and you're using Panopto, there are knowledge check tools built into Panopto that you can pause your presentation and have the students answer a few questions. You want to make sure to account for this though in your video presentation by adding, transition statements to the viewers so that they know that questions are coming and that the video just isn't like locking up and freezing on them. This helps orient them in their video as well. If you're presenting your lecture as a synchronous video through Google Meets or Teams, you can poll your students and have them use the built-in tools to provide feedback, the little thumbs up or, the sad face if they disagree and the happy face if they agree. And I've seen some people are using emoticons in the chat room to agree with some of the things being said in the chat. So that's another way. So given this information, how can you modify your current lectures? Remember, your presentation should be a focused teaching tool for the topic and not a brain dump of everything that you can find on the topic. Use your lecture video in conjunction with other materials and keep your slides simple. AI tools can be a huge time saver for you to help reduce your slide materials, minimize some of the things you have on screen. AI tools also help if you're having trouble coming up with stories or images or case studies or other narrative elements to your lecture. Various AI tools can help you kind of get past the blank slates phase of your, if you're looking at just a white screen, you're not quite sure where to start. AI can help you get started with that. You can search the web for Creative Commons images, like I mentioned, or the LRC is a good place to get some help too. Always remember, though, with the AI that, it's not always accurate. It seems like it is a lot of times, but you always want to check and double check and make sure that any research that the AI comes up with is valid research. And you want to just make sure that the information is correct. Finally, remember earlier in the narrative list that I had, there was one in there that said call to learn. This is basically, what do we do with this information now? Guiding learners towards how they can actually use what they've learned is key in making storytelling work in education. So here's your call to learning. Given the elements that you've learned today, what's the one thing that you can go back and modify in your presentation today to make it more effective? That's the power we're unlocking today. Not just presenting information, but making it stick, making it resonate, and making it actionable for your learners. The principles of compelling narratives, clear visuals, and engaging delivery aren't just nice to haves in medical education. They're essential tools for shaping the next generation of healthcare leaders. So thank you. Now go forth and present with your superpower.
Thank you for watching today's Teaching with Technology Brown Bag. You can view all Teaching with Technology Brown Bags on the USU YouTube channel under the full ETI playlist. Have a nice day.